So as I drove home from the masjid that night, I was haunted by the image of Muhammad's face. Because I just had the good news a couple of months earlier that my wife was pregnant with our first child, who would turn out to be a daughter. And I was wondering, as I was driving back to the masjid that night, well, 16 years from now, will I too be looking at the fellow members of my community with that same vacant, defeated expression on my face? And so I started writing. I began writing, recording my experiences of what it was like to be an American convert to Islam in the United States of America, assuming that somehow my children might relate to my experience. Figuring that we're both from the United States of America, the difficulties and problems that I face, they might be able to relate to them, and it might be of some help to them. So I wrote my first book, which I entitled it Struggling to Surrender. I wrote it for my children, and I left it on my shelf in a manuscript form for my children. But my friends used to come over and want to read it, and I lend it to them, and they read it. And finally, they kept saying, "Jeff, you've got to try to publish this. You've got to try to publish it." So I did, and it got published. And then something interesting happened. I began receiving emails from converts from the United States and Canada. Not emails. That time the email, Al Gore hadn't invented it yet. I began receiving letters and telephone calls and other forms of communication of converts mostly, saying that they very much, back in those days, of course not everybody could relate to my experience. Some had very different experiences. But I received, many, many emails of converts sharing similar experiences, feeling that they relate to mine. And I noticed from our communications that the converts that many, many converts that I communicated with, our paths to Islam and our paths thereafter intersected at many key points. And based on that, I wrote another book for my children, and I called it Even Angels Act. And a large part of it is devoted to theology, the theological type of questions that drive many Americans, not just Muslims, from belief in God. And I try to describe what kind of answers many of us have found in the Quran. And again, my friends encouraged me to publish it. I ended up publishing it. It came out, and then something remarkable happened. I began receiving emails, mostly emails, because now it was email generation. I began receiving email after email after email after email from young people in America and Canada who were struggling with their faith, young Muslims. A large number of them, a good percentage, said they had already left the faith. They weren't Muslims anymore. Many felt they were on the verge of leaving the faith. Almost all of them felt they were in a crisis, a faith crisis. It was an interesting sample. It's not your average American Muslim person who was emailing me. Most American Muslim young people growing up there have no connection to religion aside from the fact they know it's in their heritage. Most of them come from families that are disconnected from the mosque, so they don't really feel the need to become connected to it. Most of them, the whole idea of religion is on the shelf. This is a much more intense crowd. These were people, many of them, that grew up in religious families and that were struggling with their religion. These were people that had become atheists, but still were tormented to the extent that they needed to double-check things. It was an interesting group. And I began to record these communications. I opened a file, and began to put them in there. And the file of those communications quickly grew to 100 pages, and then 200 pages, and then 300 pages, so I reduced the font size, and 400 pages, 500 pages, and now over 1,300 pages long. And based on those communications, I wrote my next book, which was called Losing My Religion, A Call for Help. Because one of the emails I received was entitled, Losing My Religion, A Call for Help. So I changed the file to that name. Because I felt that this was a very important perspective that our community should be aware of. This is vital information. Because if we want to know why these young people aren't coming, it's not like they're going to come knocking on the door and tell us. It's a very hard group. Most of them will never share their experiences with their parents. time and time again, I would get these emails, and I stopped doing this. But the first few years, I would invariably email them back and say, why don't you discuss this with your parents? Why don't you discuss this with your local imam? Why don't you discuss this with a religious leader in your community? And they would send me back things like, are you crazy, Dr. Wang? They would totally freak out. I would be disinherited. My father would kill me. My parents would say I shamed the entire family and every generation of it because I went and talked to the imam about these questions. So I realized that we have a major crisis on hand. We have young people in crisis, in a faith crisis, who had nowhere to go to. I mean, the very fact that they were seeking out some obscure author in the very middle of the United States of America, in a small Muslim community, in an isolated area, tells you just how desperate their situation was. So, I think it's an important perspective, because if these people, who have enough concern to actually seek out somebody to help them with their problems, have these problems, you could be sure that the much greater numbers of second-generation Muslims who have nothing to do with religion, have no concern with it, if they were to encounter the community, if they were to try to participate in the community, they would have very similar problems. So I wrote that book. I didn't know what was going to happen to it, and that's an interesting story, but I'm not going to tell you that. Today I'm just going to share with you what was shared with me. Let's see, what time is it? 5 up, is that right? 8 up? 7 up? Is that right? 9 up, thank you. Okay, so I'll take about 20 minutes, 25 minutes to share with you what they shared with me. Don't stone the messenger. And then I'll talk about 20 minutes or so, 25 minutes, how we might approach that, and then I guess we can discuss it after. I wish I had all the answers. I don't. But I think these are important issues and they need to be talked about. We need to be aware of it. It needs to be moved up to the front of our community's agenda at meetings and conferences and publications and so forth. Well, where have all these children gone? What kind of problems did they present to me? Well, one, top of the list, believe it or not. Oh, you'll probably believe it. Top of the list is, of course, culture clash. The clash between the mosque culture, the culture of the mosque, and the surrounding society. And chief thing, the principal item in this category, of course, was the treatment of women in their local Muslim community. The treatment of women. Here's some of what they shared with me. Many of these young people complained that, and they usually said that Islam does these things. They didn't say the community does these things, or the community, this happens in the community. They'd email me and say, Islam makes it this way. They all very often identify these things with Islam because they were told that these things were Islam, or were demanded by Islam. They said women were discouraged from attending the congregational prayers, the 5 daily prayers. They said that women were placed in secluded, separate areas away from the main prayer hall so that they would be secluded from the men. And for many of them, this was a major problem. The seclusion of women in their communities was a major problem.